Everybody. Great to see you all in this first of 4 sessions that we're calling Story of the Book, or the Story of the Good Book, I forget exactly, Past, Present, and Future of Scripture. We could also think of it as sort of like a series on Scripture before, during, and after the book, or the print book, if you wanted to think of it that way. And I just want to say thank you as well to those of you who presented and participated in our last series on Queer Theology 2.0. That is wrapping up, and that has wrapped up, and now we are moving into this new series. But it was a fantastic series, and I'm just really grateful for all of the wholehearted engagement from everyone around that. So, story of the book. Today we're going to talk about what would Jesus read. I hope you all wore your bracelets, your WWJR bracelets. The teenagers love those. From the early Jesus movement to the Imperial Roman Church, and we are really fortunate to have back with us today to lead us in this exploration and discussion, Dr. Christy Cobb. She's been with us a couple times before, and we're happy to welcome her back. Christy is an assistant professor of Christianity at the University of Denver. Her research and teaching focuses on slavery, gender, sexuality, the Gospels, Acts, and early Christian literature. She has published a book in 2019 called Slavery, Gender, Truth, and Power in Luke, Acts, and Other Ancient Narratives. And more recently, just last year, she co-edited another book called Sex, Violence, and Early Christian Texts. She has published in some really stellar academic biblical studies journals like Biblical Interpretation. Actually, I published my first article in Biblical Interpretation in 1993, so a while ago. Might have been the first issue. At any rate, and also the Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies and the Journal for Feminist Studies in Religion. So we're lucky to have you back with us, and we're looking forward to this. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christy Cobb.
Thank you so much for having me again. I remembered last time how many questions you all had, which was a really exciting thing for me, and so I'm going to make sure today also to leave some time at the end for some Q&A, if you have some. All right, so I'm going to begin today by telling you about a fascinating new discovery that was all over my newsfeed in the month of August. And this is called P-Oxy 5575. Anybody in here other than me heard of it? Okay, 2 people, this is great. So what this is an early papyrus fragment that has sayings of Jesus on it that we've never seen before. Okay, so we've never seen this fragment before, and it has, this is really tiny. On your screen it looks huge. In real life it's this big. All right, so I could hold it in my hand. So this was actually first discovered in an archaeological dig over 100 years ago at a location in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. And so that's where the name comes from. The P stands for papyrus, and the Oxy stands for Oxyrhynchus. And so over 100 years ago, 2 archaeologists were digging in basically an ancient trash heap. So it was a dump, like a place where ancient people put their trash. And they were digging, and they found a whole bunch of papyri from like, the first 3 centuries, perhaps, maybe first 4 centuries. And they found actually over 500,000 papyri. So this was 100 years ago. They have been slowly going through all these papyri. and basically identifying them, translating them, and then publishing them in this whole collection of books that includes all the fragments that they found in Oxyrhynchus. This one was just published in August, and it's exciting for a number of reasons. And first is that, so let's see if I'm trying to make it more exciting for you. It's a new gospel. And the other exciting thing about it is that it was dated by a number of scholars to the 2nd century. And the reason that this is really exciting is we don't have many, when we talk about the development of the New Testament and early Christian literature, we do not have many fragments that date to the 2nd century. Not many at all. We just have a few that date to the 2nd century. And so if this is really dated to the 2nd century, it's very exciting. And the other thing that's exciting about it is it contains sayings of Jesus from at least 3 Gospels. One is Matthew, one is Luke, and then one is the Gospel of Thomas. And so it contains sayings mixed from these 3 Gospels. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what's inside of it. So first of all, as you saw, the fragment is tiny and just has phrases. And so we have to do, as scholars, a lot of work figuring out where they come from. And so it seems like you'll see a lot of dots. That's because we don't have the full phrase on that little tiny fragment. But it does include sayings about worry and anxiety. So do not worry what you will eat, your body, what you will wear. Does that sound familiar to you all? This is a saying from the Sermon on the Mount. So this is found in Matthew 6:25 and Luke, and then the GT there is Gospel of Thomas 36. So just underneath that, there's a saying about unless you fast from the world, you won't enter the kingdom of God. That saying is only found in Thomas. It's not found in Matthew or Luke or Mark. And then the third saying is the birds of the air, which is basically who clothes the birds of the air. The Heavenly Father will feed them. And that's found in both Matthew and Luke, or who feeds the birds of the air, sorry. And then the next one is about the lilies. Consider how they grow, Solomon in all his glory. This is another Jesus saying found in Matthew, Luke, and the Gospel of Thomas 36. The Father knows what you need, and then seek his kingdom. Those 2 sayings are from Matthew and Luke. So that's what we know from this fragment that's pieced together. So what can this tell us? All right, so first, this is, again, one of our oldest fragments that we have. Older than most of our fragments from the New Testament that we have, we can date back. If it really is, in fact, confirmed that this is a 2nd century text, that is, scholars are still really heavily debating it. So what it means is that early Christians in the 2nd century were taking sayings of Jesus and sort of mixing them up. Right? They weren't reading Matthew or thinking about Matthew in terms of Matthew's exact order or Matthew's exact vocabulary or language or Luke's or Thomas's. They're pulling from each source and sort of mixing them together and reading them for their own use, which I think is a really interesting way of reading, because what we often do as biblical scholars is really stick to Matthew or stick to Luke or maybe stick to Thomas, but we don't often pull from a variety of sources. But whoever wrote this papyrus did, right? Pulled from these sources. So the writer combined passages, it seems like, from the same theme. And what does this tell us? Early Christians also worried. They were also anxious just like us today, and thinking about that. So the reason I'm starting here with this is because we're still discovering things about what Jesus might have read or things about the development of early Christian literature. We're still figuring it out. This discovery is pretty new, and the biblical scholars at least have been really abuzz talking about this fragment and what it could possibly be. And so the things I'll tell you today might change in 10 years. We're still learning quite a bit as we go. Okay, so I'm going to return now back to the New Testament. You you all know all of this, I imagine, but I'm just going to remind you of a few things. When we think about when the New Testament was first written, the earliest texts that we have are by Paul, right? So 1 Thessalonians, probably written 48, maybe 49, somewhere around then by Paul. But as I said, we don't have those original fragments. We have later fragments of letters by Paul. But Paul's letters are earliest that we can get to for early Christian literature. The Gospels follow. So Mark is thought to be our earliest gospel, written in probably 70. And then Matthew, Luke, and John follow after that. Thomas also would be somewhere in that range, likely, or maybe into the early 2nd century. And then the Acts of Apostles is next. That's also something that has changed in recent years. When I was in graduate school learning, everyone dated Acts to the end of the 1st century, and now Acts scholars are dating Acts to the beginning of the 2nd century, basically because of contemporaneous literature from that period. Our latest text is 2 Peter, around 150, so the sort of middle of the 2nd century, and other general epistles sort of fall before that as well. So this gives you an idea when this New Jesus fragment was written, P. Oxy 5575, it could have been the same time as 2 Peter. It could have been written in the same sort of, window of time as 2 Peter, which is found in our New Testament. All right, so now we're going to think about the ways that early Christians wrote and the way that these texts were even disseminated out into early Christianity. So first, paper. What did they write on? So the earliest fragments that we have, like P. Oxy, are on papyrus. And that's made from this plant up at the top. It's a very cool sort of system that was developed where they took the stems of the papyrus plant and laid them first, either horizontally and then also another layer vertically, and then pressed them together, and we have basically a sheet of paper, papyrus. And that was the cheapest way to make ancient paper. And so much of our fragments are recorded on papyrus. But that's not the only way only form of paper that ancient authors used. Parchment is another way. It was more expensive because it was made through animal hides, basically. Sheep and calves and goats. And they had to go through a pretty long process of using that animal skin and preparing it, stretching it out, and making it into a piece of paper that can then be used. The parchment would last a bit longer than papyrus, so it would be a bit thicker and would have, sort of a longer life. But papyrus was much sort of easier to find. But then also people used a variety of other things to write on, such as wax tablets, where then you could erase a little bit and go back. It was harder to do that on papyrus or parchment. And, I misspelled that, wood, it should be. Sorry about that, wood. So just pieces of wood that might be used as a writing thing. And then also even just anything they could get their hands on. If there was, say you had a jar in your house that broke, you might take those shards and make a grocery list on it, right? Or you might make a note to a friend or a note to remember something. So early Christians were using a variety of material in which to write. How did those then form into full texts? Well, the earliest texts that we have are written on something called a book roll or a scroll. And the way that the early Christians made those is by basically taking pieces of papyrus and basically pasting them together into a really long section of text. And they could do this with parchment too, but most often we find it with papyrus. And so they might make it 20 feet long or 30 feet long in order to fit, say, the whole Gospel of Mark on one book roll, or Paul's letter to the Romans on one long book roll. And so they were written inside of the scroll and would be rolled up in order to protect the ink, but then also in order for sort of, safekeeping. And so when a person was reading a scroll, they would open it up just one part and read a column, and then they could unroll and re-roll and read a second column, and then keep going like that. And so the scrolls worked pretty well for that purpose, for reading, for copying, and for travel, basically, safekeeping. So I have an example of an intact scroll. This is the Constitution of the Athenians, and it's in the British Library. And if you might be able to see, you can even see the places where the papyrus was pasted together, right? And then, so in the middle, you can kind of see each column. Now, see at the end how this piece of papyrus is sort of falling off? That's where we have, when we're looking to ancient fragments, it's often the ends that end up sort of decaying the most. But some new other exciting technology that I'll tell you about is that some people have figured out how to use computers to read the inside of scrolls when they are unable to become unrolled. So just last week, actually, there's some scrolls that were basically destroyed when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the 1st century. And a bunch of these scrolls have been saved. And a student actually used AI technology and sort of a computer to look inside the scroll and figure out the text on the inside. So again, we have this technology that's being used to figure out ancient texts, what they might have said, is really exciting because we have a number of texts that have been decaying and that we can't open because of perhaps a volcanic eruption, but technology is helping us to read. So we might discover even more Jesus texts in the future through those kind of technology. Okay, so next up is the Codex. So scrolls were used quite a lot, right? But usually only held one text at a time. Sometimes a scroll might have a more shorter text sort of pieced together, but when we're thinking of the Gospels, one Gospel would be on one scroll usually. So what happened when early Christians started circulating multiple texts at a time? For example, the 4 Gospels might often want to be circulated together, or all of Paul's letters might want to be. Well, they started using a form of book called the Codex. And so they would take, this could be papyrus or parchment, but mostly the examples we have now are on parchment. And so they would take a piece of parchment and basically bind them together using sewing. So they would sew the edges together, pretty much like a book is bound today in very similar ways. And they would also put a cover on it, and then the codex would be able to, easily be taken to another location. We see more of these in Christianity develop we have some pieces of codex from the 2nd century, but more in the 3rd century and even more in the 4th century as Christianity grew. And so we have are from the scrolls. There we go, we're back. Using, with the fragments being found in the... So the codex, though, can tell us quite a lot about, again, what early Christians were wanting to read and how they collected their texts together. Because I'll remind you that at this point, New Testament texts were written, but there was no official New Testament. There was no Okay, is that good? Okay. I was about to say I can also use my teacher voice if needed to be loud. Okay, this is working quite well. Okay, so we don't have a canonized New Testament when many of these codices together. We have examples of what early Christians might have thought were circulating together, but we don't have an official New Testament. And so these codices can tell us what early Christians thought belonged in one book, or maybe what a community wanted to read. So I'm going to show you a few examples. All right, this is Codex Vaticanus. So this is, I think, really beautiful. You can see the Greek written in these columns and also a little bit of annotations written throughout. And so this is a sample from Codex Vaticanus. Let's see, here we go. Codex Vaticanus is likely dated to the middle of the 4th century. So this is again into the title that was given to me, Early Christianity to Roman Imperial Christianity. This is sort of in the beginning of Roman Imperial Christianity that Vaticanus was created. Now, it had the New Testament, except it's missing some texts, which is really interesting. So it doesn't have 1st and 2nd Timothy in it. It doesn't have Titus. It doesn't have Philemon, one of my favorite of Paul's letters because it deals with slavery. It doesn't have Revelation. Think of how important Revelation is to many Christians today, and this early codex is missing it altogether. And so again, we can look to Codex Vaticanus and say this is perhaps one of our earliest codices that we have the full copy of, and yet it's not still a full canonized New Testament as we see it today. So the early Christians who pieced this together or who were reading it didn't think Revelation needed to be included for whatever reason, right? Didn't think Philemon or 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus needed to be included. The next one, which is my personal favorite, is Codex Sinaiticus. This is an example of sort of a few pages. It has 4 columns on each side, as you can see, and Codex Sinaiticus is right now housed in the British Library. Some fragments of it are in other places, but the bulk of it is in the British Library in London. So what we can know from Codex Sinaiticus, so it's traditionally dated the 4th century, but some recent scholarship has pushed that date a little bit later, even into the 5th century. And so maybe late 4th century, maybe even early 5th century. It's made of animal skin, and we know that at least 4 scribes copied it. I'm going to talk about scribes in just a second. So this would have been a really expensive book, because if you think of all the pages needed and all the animal skins used to create this, and then also the time and devotion the 4 scribes put into this. This includes the Hebrew Bible, along with the Jewish apocryphal texts, and it includes all 27 books that are in our current New Testament, but it also includes 2 more. So it includes 2 early Christian apocryphal texts. That's the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. Anybody heard of the Shepherd of Hermas in here? Oh, good, a couple of people. It's a really beautiful apocryphal text that's, dated pretty early, and early Christians really seemed to like it, read it a lot, and valued it, but it didn't end up in our New Testament. So I think for that reason, a lot of people today don't read it, even though here it is here in this 4th or 5th century book. So what this tells us is by the middle of the 4th century, this is past Constantine as sort of the Roman emperor, and when Christianity has become a large part of the Roman Empire, we have a New Testament with 2 extra books. So again, not a full canonized New Testament as we see it today, but 2 additional books that must have been important to the creators of this codex. Okay, so now I'm going to talk for a minute about the New Testament canon. I've been hinting at it, but let's get to a little bit of that discussion. So we have the first person to really sort of propose a New Testament canon was Marcion, who was ultimately determined to be a heretic by early Christians. And he proposed a number of texts that he said should be read, and that did not include the Gospels, actually. And so he was like, read these texts, which were mostly Paul, and don't read the Gospels. So we have our early first canon that was sort of proposed, would be one that certainly doesn't match our New Testament today. Around 180, Irenaeus wrote, and he wants he writes that the 4 Gospels are what people should be reading and not any other Gospels. So he says, the 4 Gospels, it matches the 4 corners of the world. So therefore, we should read only the 4 Gospels. And so what this indicates to us is that there were some early Christians reading more than the 4 Gospels. Maybe they were reading the Gospel of Thomas. Maybe they were reading the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel to the Hebrews. And so they were in reading these others, so enough so that Irenaeus felt he needed to stop that. Only read, he said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that comes up in 180. Now, the first list that has our 27 books that are part of the New Testament is 367, and that's Athanasius. And so he develops this, and this ends up becoming our New Testament canon. But what's interesting about Athanasius is he also values other books as well. So I have this quote from Athanasius. This is a letter 39, which is called his Easter letter. And he writes in it, I'm going to sort of jump down to the end. So the wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of Sirach, Esther, Judith, and Tobit, the teaching of the apostles, we call that the Didache. And then the shepherd, that's the shepherd of Hermas. The former are included in the canon, the latter being merely read, nor is there any place a mention of apocryphal writings. So he names these as important to be read, but not exactly canon. So he has this sort of second category of texts that are important to be read and important to be studied by Christians, but that aren't a part of what he calls his New Testament canon. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing to add, that our first canon list of canonical texts includes the prioritization of some other texts as well, in addition to the 27. So even after Athanasius, though, there's no consensus, as we saw. So Athanasius wrote this in 367, so that's the middle of the 4th century. Likely, Sinaiticus was put together this same time and included the shepherd, included Barnabas. So there was no consensus even with Athanasius's letter, right? And also, there was no council who voted on a canon. So sometimes I think my students will come to class and say, no, Nicaea voted on a canon, the Council of Nicaea. But the Council of Nicaea actually didn't vote on a canon, and so we don't have a vote. The actual official vote for the canon comes in 1546, so much later. But there was a sort of, let's say, move by early Christians to read these 27 books. So while there was no official vote, many Christians were focusing on those books, and then some might read some additional texts and might include those in their reading as well. Okay, let's talk about scribes, and then soon I will move to a question and answer session so that I can see what other questions you all might have about this. This is a sort of pictorial example of what a scribe might be doing. That is copying a biblical text or a scriptural text and then basically making a copy of it. As you'll probably get into in the next few weeks, early Christians didn't have a printing press, didn't have copy machines. It was all human labor that led to the copying of text. And so before we even get to the scribes, I want to add something else, which is what we might call a secretary. And that is that as an author might be writing something, they would often dictate it, and someone would be sitting beside them writing it down. This is an ancient secretary. Not every author used this, but many did in antiquity. And Paul is our best example of this, and I'll give you a few verses of that about how we know that Paul used secretaries in a few minutes. But basically, it seems like Paul might be reciting his letter out loud, and then a secretary would be sitting beside him, writing down his words and turning them into the letter that we know today. Most ancient secretaries were enslaved. This crosses over into my work on slavery, and that's that a job of an enslaved person might be to be a secretary for their enslaver. So they weren't always paid. There were some enslaved persons who received some funds for their work, but many of them were doing this as a part of their enslavement, forced labor that they were using. And so they would, for their enslaver, be trained to copy down all of their words, right? And scribes also in early Christianity were often enslaved. So when we move into later Christianity, some of this work gets moved into monasteries, and monks serve as scribes. But before the monastery, in early Christianity, and even when there was a monastery, much of the work of copying early Christian texts was done by enslaved persons, who their whole job would be to basically copy these texts in order for them to be disseminated around the church. And so then this is another interesting part, is that secretaries were trained to use a shorthand system, similar to what might have happened in the past in America, that people who anybody still know shorthand in here? A few people. And so enslaved persons who were serving as secretaries would learn this system, and it was really elaborate, and it might mean that even a free elite author couldn't read shorthand, that they would take a look at their notes and really not know what this might say, because it was such an elaborate language that was developed. And so secretaries had a really big role in the writing of the New Testament, and scribes too, in the copying of the New Testament. Let me show you the examples from Paul's letters. So Romans 16 is our best example. We have a name for a secretary. This is Tertius. So I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. When I teach Paul, I often tell my students, don't stop reading when you get to the greetings, because it's a really important piece who Paul is saying hello to. Often that's where the women are in Paul's letters, are often being greeted or discussed in the very end of a letter. Here we see likely Tertius is enslaved and is Paul's secretary, and he sneaks in a little hello to the Romans. I, Tertius, am greeting you. This is his own words. Like, Paul didn't say that to him. He's writing it into the letter. But then twice, Paul seems like we can imagine him coming up to his secretary and taking it and writing a sentence himself. So we see that in Galatians 6:11. He says, "See what large letters I make when I am writing with my own hand." And that's a really interesting thing, because it also shows that secretaries and scribes were taught to write really small, tight letters to fit everything onto these small papyrus and book scrolls. But when Paul himself, not trained as a scribe or a secretary, writes, he writes in big letters. And you see that in 1 Corinthians 2, he might wrote a sentence to, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. So those are three places we can see evidence that Paul was using a secretary to write his letters. So there's some interesting work that's been done around this very recently, the participation of enslaved persons in the writing of the New Testament. And so I'm going to pitch a book to you. This is not out yet. It'll be out in March of 2024, and it's by the scholar named Candida Moss. And she is put together this evidence of the ways that it's called God's ghostwriters enslaved Christians and the making of the Bible. And what her premise is here is that when a secretary is dictating, the secretary has a little bit of leeway to include their own voice in that dictation. And if you've ever done anything like shorthand before, you might know this, that you can change a slight phrase, right? Add in a word when you think it's necessary. And so it might not be exactly word for word what Paul had wanted, and a secretary might have added in a phrase here and there. And scribes too did this as they were copying, might correct things or add a phrase when the person might have been thinking it was necessary. And we've really given no credit to these secretaries or scribes. We give all the credit to really Paul or the writer of the gospel. And Dr. Moss's work is trying to remedy that by saying, let's look to the value of enslaved persons in not only just participating in early Christianity, but in the writing of the New Testament. And how might that change our view by thinking these marginalized persons basically helped in the creation of our New Testament. Okay, so finally, disseminations. How did these texts get out? So texts were shared with communities. We see this in some of Paul's letters too, that if Paul might have sent a letter to Philippi, the Philippians, then they might have read it and passed it along to Corinth, right? Or passed it along to the community in Athens or in Thessaloniki. And so they were sharing letters around and trading. And then so they would swap texts with one another, and someone might read it out loud to the community when they got that text. And who were delivering these texts back and forth? Again, enslaved persons. Sometimes a free person, when they might be traveling, would take texts along with them. But if they weren't traveling and they needed a text to get someplace, an enslaved person would be their messenger, basically mail delivery service. And we can see this from a number of different letters and in the world of antiquity, that someone would be going and send an enslaved person on an errand, for example, and might deliver the text back and forth. So again, enslaved persons have did a lot of work in this creation of the New Testament and in the spreading out of these texts and the sharing of these texts. When a text became popular and people wanted to read it, then it was copied. And that was, again, a painstaking process, right, done by these scribes who were often enslaved. They would make a copy and then send it on. And then that community might take it, make a copy, and send it on. And that's how we get a large number of texts from this period spread out. Okay, so this is my last bit, and then I'll take some questions. So here's some conclusions from this sort of sweeping tour of the development of the book in early Christianity. So our earliest texts that we have are written on papyrus and are in a scroll or a book roll form. But when early Christians wanted to collect a number of texts together, they started using the form of the codex, and they would bind then the text together into what looks today like a book that we might call a codex. And enslaved persons were used in the writing, the copying, the development of these New Testament texts, and texts of early Christianity. And then finally, early Christians valued texts, right? They valued them, they read them, they shared them, they copied, they discussed them. And to return back to the P-Oxy 5575, they would take pieces of different texts and collect them together into new texts that might have been of importance to them around a particular theme. All right, so that is all that I have, and I'd love to hear if you all have any questions about this material. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, good, yes.
Is this?
I have a question.
Yes.
The very at the beginning, the fragment recent fragment you showed
Yes.
us, that referenced the Gospel of Thomas. What is the provenance for the Gospel of Thomas? How much of it is out there? And it's curious that it never made it into the canon.
Yes, great question. We have what we think of as the whole of the text of the Gospel of Thomas. We have it in a language called Coptic, which was an Egyptian language from ancient times. And the reason we have a lot of texts from Egypt is because of papyrus, and the sort of desert environment made these texts able to survive a bit longer than in some other regions. And so we have it in Coptic, and then we also have translations of it in other languages as well. Most scholars would date the Gospel of Thomas to the early 2nd century. Some have dated it to the late 1st, or middle 1st even. So the dating is sort of all over. But I think a sort of conservative dating might be the early 2nd century. As for why it wasn't canonized, there's a lot of sort of debate about that as well. But it had some. Have you heard of the term Gnosticism? Have you all heard of Gnostic Christianity? So Gnosticism is this sort of, let's say, early Christian sect or group of Christians that were thinking about spirituality in this way that was that Orthodox or proto-Orthodox Christians didn't agree with. And the Gospel of Thomas has a few of those sayings in it. And so when early Christians were looking at texts that they didn't want other Christians to read, early Christian leaders, let's say, they often pushed aside texts that had Gnostic influences in it. And so that, I would say, is probably the major reason the Gospel of Thomas wasn't included, but it was certainly popular, as we can see in this fragment. And quite a lot of the Gospel of Thomas is in Matthew and Luke, actually, and in Mark. I mean, we have sayings from the Gospel of Thomas that are really familiar, and then we have sayings that aren't included in Matthew and Luke. Thank you. You can look it up online to read it if you want when you get home. It's pretty easy to find, I think.
What languages were most commonly used in these texts? And is there one that's like, is Greek the most common, or?
Yes, great question. Yeah, Greek is the most common, but Coptic, a number of our texts are in Coptic. Some of our early texts are in Syriac, another language from this period. But the bulk of the texts were written in Greek, as many people in the 1st and 2nd century were speaking and reading in Greek, and that was what was often taught. But Coptic, if the text was written in Coptic, sometimes people think it was originally written in Greek, copied or translated into Coptic, and the Coptic survived. Sometimes people even say that some of the texts were written in Hebrew and then copied into Greek because of the influence of ancient Judaism upon early Christianity. Great question.
It's my understanding that the language that was spoken during Christ's time was Aramaic. Is that correct?
Yes, in ancient Palestine. Yes.
Okay, well then, in other words, in order to have the Gospels, it had to be translated from Aramaic into Greek.
Well, many of the gospel writers we think were speaking and reading in Greek as well. And so maybe they also spoke in Aramaic. Likely they did. But they would have been able to read Greek as well.
Okay, last thing. If that's so, wouldn't it be difficult for people that didn't know Greek to have the gospel? Because,
Yes, yes, absolutely. The Gospels we date to after 70, and the important thing that happened in 70 is the destruction of the Second Temple, which was in Jerusalem. And so the Gospels, many of them might have been written outside of that region, which is why that we have them in Greek. And most people do think they were originally written in Greek. But you're exactly right that if someone didn't know Greek, how could they read this? And that would be through hearing or through translation, right? Or through someone reading out loud and then sharing those stories with them if they weren't able to read Greek. Yeah. So they were as bad as the Roman Catholics. I think a lot of early Christians were likely multilingual, and so were able to kind of, talk in multiple languages. But yes, it would have been difficult for these texts to get to some groups of people, I think. You're right. Yeah. Okay, I can repeat that if you want. It was who were the slaves and who were the enslavers. So slavery was a large part of the Greco-Roman Empire, and we also find slaves in ancient Palestine as well. And we might say 10 to 15% of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. In some places, more like 20%. And those people that were enslaved were, many of them born into slavery. And so they would have been basically bred as enslaved persons. As far as enslavers go, it's a pretty big range. I mean, definitely the elite were enslavers, but also we have evidence that even sort of a moderate, family, or even like a sort of, I don't know, we might say lower middle class family today, might have been able to have at least one enslaved person in their house, maybe two enslaved persons. So it wasn't only the elite. It could have been, a variety of people. But the elite would have had a large amount of enslaved persons working for them, especially if they ran a business or had a large farm or something along those lines. Yeah, I'll stop there. I can keep talking about that. Yeah, in the back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When we visited parts of the Holy Land, there was a lot of emphasis on the secrecy and the fact that the early Christians were persecuted. And could you share what's the thinking on how that might have affected the content of the writings and what was lost and so forth?
So, okay, I'll say scholars today sort of push back against that narrative that early Christians were being persecuted at large numbers and were having to live in secret. So what that means is that this narrative that's been sort of spread that all Christians were hiding and had to be, use secret signs to get around is really one that was created in order to, basically create, well, one scholar might say cultural memory of and Christian identity, create Christian identity. The scholar I mentioned earlier, actually, Candida Moss, has a book out called Myth of Persecution. So if you're interested, you could grab that book. That pushes against that. So in general, we say that persecution happened sporadically and locally, but it wasn't everywhere and it wasn't every place. And so there would have been really no need to sort of hide Christian texts. They were sharing them pretty regularly, except for occasionally when there was a period of persecution. Thank you for that question. You all have so many good questions. I love this.
So the Council of Trent was a Roman Catholic
Yes.
group. Okay, so they did include the Apocrypha?
The Jewish Apocrypha.
The Jewish Apocrypha.
Correct. So there's a set of texts that's not included in the sort of Jewish scriptures that's called the Tanakh. And the Jewish Apocrypha were texts that were still really important within Judaism and also important within early Christianity. And so those texts are canonized in the Catholic Bible. If you have, I don't know what Bibles you have in your aisles, likely they would not include the Apocrypha in a Protestant church. He's confirming for me. No. So most Protestant churches don't include the Jewish Apocrypha, but Catholic Bibles do.
So when did that get dropped?
The
Jewish
Protestant
Apocrypha?
Reformation.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that when the Protestant Reformation happened, people started saying we should not be reading these texts. I will say, if you ever take a New Testament class with me or a Bible class, I still teach the Apocrypha because it's important to the New Testament. And so I think
That you mentioned, how many copies of those are they and where are they?
oh, there's just one.
Just one. And where
Yes.
is that?
It's in the British Library in
Oh,
London.
British Library. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
you can go see it. You can visit it. It's under glass,
Oh.
so you can't touch it. But you can.
I just recently got to see the Codex Purpureus Rosanna,
Oh, cool.
which is from the 5th to 6th century,
Yes.
Matthew and Mark,
Lovely.
in southern Italy, which was really gorgeous.
Yes, that's exciting that you were able to see that.
There's a nice online tool for Codex Sinaiticus too, and you can go and explore it. Because it comes from some different locations, and they've collected it together into a single digital copy. That's
Yes,
a great.
my picture came from there.
yeah.
So it's a great tool.
You've painted a picture for us of a wide diversity of thinking in the early church. And we just finished a series here in this congregation about LGBTQ inclusion in the church.
Yes.
And the pushback I get from my conservative relatives is that we're moving away from biblical Christianity or historical Christianity and orthodoxy. I wonder if you could speak to diversity of thinking within the church. Has there ever been a time that's been more orthodox or where everybody sort of agreed? Could you widen your view a little bit and kind of give us a story of diversity of thinking within the Christian tradition?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I guess to that question, I would probably say no, like in the sense that there's always been diversity in Christianity. You're right that my portrait comes from these early years, right, from the 1st century to the 4th century. And there would have been Christians in Ephesus in Turkey reading a different set of texts than the Christians that were reading in Rome, right? Or Christians that were reading in Athens, Greece. And so if I did sort of you said broaden, but I'll say if I go more specific to these, and we put these Christians beside each other, we might find a very different set of texts that they're reading, right? Because of the way texts traveled and the way that, and they were expensive and hard to get. And so a Christianity that might be developed off of the Gospel of Mark might look pretty different than a Christianity that developed from the Gospel of John. Right? As far as diversity, I think it was rich. I think there were quite a lot there's a lot of diverse thinking in early Christianity, and I think there would have been, as far as LGBTQ inclusion, when we look to some of the early texts, we can see evidence that there might have been some early Christians who might have been same-sex attracted or might have had sort of different views of this. And then we see a lot of pushback against that, just as we might see today in texts. So many early church fathers were writing to say, be careful. And we see this in the monasteries, the development of the monasteries as well, when a group of men are living together and they'll say, okay, go everywhere in threes, because when you go in twos, that might be dangerous. And that hints to us that there might be two men involved in a relationship that the higher ups weren't approving of, right? But that shows that we're also still there and still present. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
So I've got, I guess, a quick comment to set up my question. And
Yes.
one is that my understanding was when they were canonizing the Bible, a lot of it was based around this orthodoxy that you had described, but effectively it led to a cohesiveness of the New Testament, if you will. And so the Apocrypha were excluded because one of these things is not like the other. At least to some degree, that's my understanding. And I know Paul had a fair bit to say about warning the others to follow the orthodoxy and to stay away from, it was mostly paganism and things of that nature, less so maybe the Eastern religions that you would get with the Gnostic Gospels. But I do wonder sometimes, did some of the Apocrypha, or what could be considered Apocrypha, make it in, actually? And specifically, I guess this leads to my question of, what's up with Revelations? If one of these things is not like the others, it would be it. And for me, Revelations reads like a hallucination, not like a logical follow-on to the rest of the New Testament. So why and how did it make it in, whereas some of these other things got the boot?
Yeah. I mean, you're asking some really good questions, I think. I would hesitate to say that all the Apocrypha are not like what we see in the New Testament, because there's quite a bit. Like if you read the Shepherd of Hermas, you're going to say, that sounds a lot like what I read in my New Testament. The Epistle of Barnabas sounds a lot like what I would read in the New Testament. There's some other sort of letters that you might read that sound very similar. And so the question of why those didn't get in and which others did is basically one of popularity and, of course, as you said, the sort of proto-Orthodox Christian leaders and the text that they preferred. So that would give the text support and might get it disseminated out to people, whereas some texts were only read maybe locally or were copied less or disseminated less. As far as Revelation, you're not wrong to question that, because early Christians were also debating about Revelation. And so as you saw, a Codex Vaticanus in the 4th century doesn't have Revelation in it. So we don't know why the person that put that together left it out, but it's not a surprise to me, as you said, because it is sort of a text that you're like, what's going on in there? But it was a text that became popular and became read around, or in early Christianity. And so I think that popularity and support from Orthodox Christian leaders often led to a text to be, let's say, included. Yeah.
I think we're going to have to wrap up. It is 10:30. Christy, thank you so much for such an engaging, wonderful presentation and for this great conversation. Thank you all for your amazing questions. I was just pulling up, I wasn't texting there, I was listening, but a funerary tomb from Rome of two men. It's an early Christian, what do they call it, sarcophagus?
Funerary monument.
Funerary monument. And two Christian men, and they only would do, they used to say, well, they were brothers or something like that, but probably not. It usually was
because see the way their hands are clasped, that is also a typical marriage portrayal, or at least partnership, let's say, right?
So a little diversity evidence there.
Yes.
Christy, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next week as we